Cradle to Grave is the 8th episode of the first season of Back to You. This is, of course, directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And I loved it. I thought it was brilliant, and we have some pretty great moments. So it starts off with the news broadcast. We find out that a news anchor called Ed Coleman has died, and Kelly has been asked to do the eulogy, and she doesn't really understand why he was kind of mean to her, but we will find out more a little later on. And we also established that Chuck isn't going to the funeral because he decided at some point he's done doing things he doesn't want to do. And his refusal to go to the funeral is significant because it allows us to bring Gracie into the story. We're then in the office and Kelly finds out that her sitter has cancelled for the time of the funeral. So Chuck says he'll babysit Gracie and Kelly is not having any of this. But then Chuck manages to convince her to allow him to babysit Gracie. And we're in the hotel. Chuck is still living in the hotel, and Kelly drops Gracie off, and the first thing Chuck does, which made my heart sing, is suggest they watch New York Minute, the Mary-Kate and Ashley film, which I love. I mean, the film's brilliant, but I love Mary-Kate and Ashley, so that made me rather happy. Gracie was not impressed. She says, and I quote, "Their movies are stupid and their lives are a mess." I disagree on several counts, but nevertheless, I love that moment. And then Chuck brings out Erzukas, which I'd completely forgotten about. Again, Gracie's not exactly having any of this. We cut to the funeral, and we do go back and forth between the funeral and Chuck and Gracie a good few times. You'll find out how many as we go through it. And I think the pacing between both parts was really well done. It never felt like we were jumping around too much. And because we're only really jumping back and forth between two locations, it does work very well. So when we're at the funeral, people are saying things about Kelly that we, the viewer, can hear, but Kelly is oblivious. And it turns out they think she meant a lot to Ed. Everyone's there. Montana's there, Marsh, Gary, Ryan. And Ryan, it turns out, doesn't know who Ed is. And we have a pretty funny scene where he's trying to remember who Ed is. He thinks it's one person, and then that person walks past him. He thinks it's somebody else, and the same thing happens. I thought that was pretty entertaining. Back at the hotel, Amber comes over. Amber is a woman Chuck has been very briefly dating, by which I mean they spent a night together. She's played by Dorie Barton. And Gracie asks her if they are boyfriend and girlfriend. And Amber says yes, Chuck says no. A little bit awkward. What's also awkward, back at the funeral, is that we find out Ed had told his country club friends that he'd been in a relationship with Kelly, and this was because he didn't want them to know he was gay. And Kelly still doesn't know this. And Marsh decides to rectify Ryan's inability to remember what Ed looked like by taking a photo of the body in the casket. Don't know why Ryan wouldn't just go and look at him. I guess this is not something he wanted to do, but seeing the casket in a photo maybe wasn't so bad. Unfortunately, Marsh drops the phone in the casket just as everybody is told to go and sit down. So Ryan's phone is now in the casket. We then go back to the hotel. And Gracie asks Chuck why he cares so much what she thinks of him and his relationship with Amber. And we, the viewer, of course, know that he cares because that's his daughter and he doesn't want his daughter to think badly of him, but he can't say that. So Gracie comes to the conclusion that he must care about her opinion because he likes her mother, Kelly, of course. And Chuck actually says no, it's because, and I quote, "I might want to be a dad someday," which I thought was a good save. That seemed like a pretty good way to kind of get out of that awkward conversation. We then go back to the funeral, and Montana suggests to Gary that Gary didn't know Ed was gay because he was romantically interested in Gary, and Gary's behaviour throughout the rest of the episode is just so funny, and just everything he says is brilliantly done. Really enjoyed Gary for the rest of this. Kelly then gives her eulogy, and obviously there are, if you're looking for them, various innuendos in her eulogy. She still doesn't know what Ed had said about her. Marsh then realises that everything she's saying is just being perceived the wrong way. He goes up and whispers to her what everybody else knows about her apparent relationship with Ed. And her response was brilliant. Her response was very genuine. And then he also whispers that this was because he wanted to hide the fact he was gay, and Gary's response to that, I thought, was fantastic. And then Ryan's phone in the casket begins to ring. We then cut back to Chuck and Gracie. They're in a bar because Gracie was bored in the hotel room, so she's in the bar spinning around and eating wasabi and spitting wasabi out. And a fan of Chuck's comes over. I love this moment. It was so sweet. He comes over and says, "I'm a big fan. Is this your daughter?" And before Chuck has a chance to say anything, Gracie says yes. And she then explains, once the fan was out of earshot, that she thought it would be less awkward than Chuck having to explain he was babysitting a kid in a bar, which I thought made sense. But the fact that she wasn't embarrassed by him to say that he was her father, I thought was a good sign, a nice little step forward. She then said, "I don't have a dad, right?" Which was a little emotional, definitely dragged the mood down a little bit. And Chuck asks her what she knows about her father, and she shares some things, and it does seem quite sad. But then she points out something that I thought was really beautiful and something that helped to lift things up. She points out that Kelly, her mother, is like a best friend to her. And Gracie thought that if her father was in the picture, she wouldn't have such a close relationship with her mother, which makes sense because it's just the two of them against the world. It makes a lot of sense. And I thought that was a really sweet way of looking at things, but it could also potentially plant the seed in Chuck's mind that maybe he shouldn't interrupt their life because he still wants Gracie to know that he's her father. But because Gracie has just said that she worries that if her father was in the picture, she wouldn't be as close with her mother, that's going to make things a little bit awkward. So I'm keen to see where we go from here. And then Kelly comes in, and obviously she's just drained from the funeral, and Chuck says rather sweetly about Gracie, "I think she got her best qualities from you," which was rather sweet. And it was a nice way to conclude that part of the story. We then end with the final scene with Ryan's phone ringing now underground, because of course Ed has been buried. And it's a good episode. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really strong narrative, or parts to the narrative. Everything worked really well. Everything flowed well. It was very well edited. We had some great comedic moments, a lovely suspense, and some really heartfelt moments, particularly between Chuck and Gracie. I can't fault it. I thought Cradle to Grave was a pretty fantastic episode.